Microsoft. I'm going to try and do one for them, too.
Right. Good morning, or perhaps I should say good afternoon to everyone. We're finding seats here.
Whose way?
All right, excellent. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm very excited to be having this discussion around digital identity and what a future around digital identity on a blockchain may look like. How many people here in the room have heard of blockchain? Just a show of hands. All right, this is great. I feel like it's impossible to go anywhere today without hearing about blockchains. So hopefully today's discussion will help elucidate some of the great work that's happening across organizations of all stripes that are really starting to bring some of this innovation around identity to the forefront of actual products, actual services that people consume. So I'll quickly introduce myself. Meltem Demirs. I'm with a company called Digital Currency Group, and we are a little bit of a unique company. We build, buy, and support Bitcoin and blockchain technology companies by leveraging our insights, our network, and our access to capital. So what that means is we act as a venture capital firm. We've invested in over 100 companies now across 27 different countries, which all leverage blockchain technology, digital currencies, or distributed computing in some capacity. Some are B2B, some are C2C, some are B2C, so a lot of different ideas encapsulated in that portfolio. And we also build and operate companies. We have a media company, CoinDesk, which I hope you will all go and read. They're a fantastic source of news for what's happening in this industry. We also have an asset management business called Grayscale, which has 2 products in the market that enable retail investors to access digital currencies in their portfolios. And then we also have a trading business that's a fully licensed broker-dealer for institutions who want to interact with digital assets. So it's a very unique company, but it gives me a lot of perspective, a lot of insight into what's happening in this blockchain space. And it also enables me to work with a lot of great corporations like Microsoft, like Deloitte, Accenture, other institutions that are all looking at helping their clients use this technology. So with that said, let's just decide what is digital identity? The word identity has a lot of different meanings, so I went online and I looked it up. And the internet tells me that a digital identity is information on an entity, so a set of attributes that are used by systems to represent an external agent. That agent could be a person, an organization, application, or a device. So today we have representatives from a variety of different companies. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, but also I want to ask them each to talk about how they conceive identity and the digitization of identity just in a short 2-minute statement. So we'll start with Melanie.
Sure. Melanie Shapiro, and I am the CEO of Tokenize. And we build a consumer device that allows people to merge their physical personhood with their digital identity. And we're actually launching next month in June. So the way that I think of identity and digital identity is that it's very separate in the physical world versus the virtual world. So in your physical world, you have personhood. You are identified in a free country with democracy and free markets as a person, and people respect you as a human being. Now, that got very complex as we had the internet, and now all of a sudden we have a digital life. And that digital life, we also have different digital versions of ourselves, or digital identities. And the way I think of digital identity is it's just a set of attributes that could be pointed back to a person. And the problem in this space, very much so, has been that those attributes or those digital identities that make up who you are very much are becoming disconnected to personhood. And that becomes very scary because you, as a person, need to have control over your social or whatever kind of identity you have in the digital world. So we're building a solution to make it possible to merge your physical self with your digital self, and so that you have complete user control of your identification, of your data. Without user control, the future of identity is very scary.
Great.
Hey there. So my name is Daniel Buckner. I head the decentralized identity product and engineering work for Microsoft. We're using a lot of the technology that Meltem alluded to develop systems that can restore identity in a self-sovereign way to the users or any other item that they're used to identify. And so what I think identity is really self-attested and externally attested attributes associated.
Sorry, what is attested? Let's just clarify.
The state may attest that you're at a certain height and weight on your driver's license, for instance. That's externally attested. Your height and weight may fluctuate, and you know what it is, or you have things that you self-attest. Self-attest meaning my favorite color is green, right? I'm the authority on my favorite color. No one else is. So I think identity is sort of the composition of those two things. A lot of stuff is self-attested. A ton of it comes from external sources, and people's view of your identity changes from person to person. People see things very differently, and identity is actually sort of like a prism in that way. So.
Hi, I'm Vinny Lingham. I'm co-founder CEO of Civic. I'll give you the long story. We started the company basically trying to solve the problem of voting, and how do you allow population groups, large and small, to participate in democracy at scale. And one of the key problems you have to solve with that, and enabling people to be able to vote on their mobile phones in the comfort of their home, security-wise, et cetera, is solving the problem of digital identity. How do you know it's that person on that device? And so that's the genesis for the thinking behind the company. And we wanted to build it in such a way that it could be globally distributed. So we looked at technologies like blockchain, and we realized that we could actually build a global system where 7 billion people could be connected to the same system and be able to vote for their local national governments. The biggest issue with building a system like this is that if we stored all your personal information in one central server, it would be kind of the worst idea ever in the history of mankind. So what we did was we built a platform that actually distributed the ID credentials to devices. So your personal device holds your information and no one else's. And in doing that, the risk of an attack vector, of a breach is minimal. They have to actually steal your device. We did some trials with Intel, so we're able to store personal information on the chips, it's called software guard extensions. So on the actual chips, lock it down, kind of the way Touch ID works with Apple. And so we basically are building this massive global distributed device-based identity platform where you can use it to log into your bank account without passwords. You can log into anything by using some sort of biometric on the device and the credentials that are stored there. Our vision is to replace passports, driver's licenses, you name it, with effectively whatever device you can secure and use.
My name's Dave Treat, I'm Accenture. I'm not going to try to add to the identity definitions. I think those
There are a lot already.
I lead our blockchain business for financial services, and I'm the deputy head of it firm-wide, which is now giving me great opportunity as a capital markets guy to get into all sorts of other industries, which is a lot of fun. For us, if there's one way of thinking about all of the work that we do supporting our clients, in that if there's a common thread around a lot of it, which is the problems associated with today's fragmented nature of identity, and so whether it's AML, KYC issues in financial services, our focus around, we've actually built and implemented a significant portion of the world's border control systems, and the like. And so we've actually now formed a dedicated blockchain identity team to think across industry in each of these modes, in each of the unique business challenges in every ecosystem and industry, applying a lot of these concepts. And so taking the notion of work we're doing in biometrics to be able to affirmatively associate a human with an identity very similar to things that you're working on, Vinny. So that's who we are. We're as the world's largest independent technology services company, we get involved in every form and flavor of this. And so.
Thank you. That's a great summary. And so my goal today, really, we have about 45 minutes. I wanted to bring together thought leaders who represent a lot of different parts of identity systems that are being built today in various capacities. And we're going to have a meandering sort of conversation. I'd love for it to be a dialogue and give you an opportunity to ask questions as well. But the point I think that all of our speakers so far have highlighted is there are many different forms of identity. As Melanie said, we have our physical identity. We also have physical cards that represent our identity, like a driver's license or birth certificate. We have digital identities, which are stored on our phones, which may be stored in centralized servers managed by service providers. And then we have virtual identities. As things become increasingly virtualized, you may be a different person on Twitter than you are on Reddit, and people now increasingly also have virtual lives they manage along with their physical and digital lives. So I really wanted to sort of talk about the way that we can leverage blockchain technology and this idea of distributed computing, of distributed systems, of non-centralized systems to bring new forms of security to identity, but also to start linking some of these different identities that may exist in different places. So really what we mean when we talk about identity, as we've highlighted, is they're people. I think people also tie back to organizations and institutions, which themselves have an identity. So I, Meltem Demirors, am an employee of Digital Currency Group. I'm a graduate of MIT, an institution. And then there are also different machines or devices. So I have an iPhone, I have a laptop. Those are all associated to me. Maybe I own a vehicle, I have a credit card that gives me the right to access certain assets, which I also own. So how do I identify all of that stuff? Well, today, the way I identify it is I have a phone, I have a credit card, I have probably hundreds of online accounts, which are mismanaged in various ways. I'm trying to use a password manager more. It is very difficult. But I think the point is we use identities for a lot of different purposes. And primarily, we use them to identify ourselves. So how do I positively identify myself? How do I authenticate or prove who I am? So if I get pulled over, I typically hand the police my driver's license, which proves that I am who I say I am. And then how do we actually use our identity to authorize something, whether it's a transaction or whether it's changing an attribute about ourselves? So let's start with people. We're all people. We care a lot about our identities. You talk about identity all day, every day with your clients, with your partners, the customers you're designing your products for. In the developed world, the world we all live in, how do you think the status quo around identity is being changed by blockchain and the idea of distributed identity systems? And how is your company specifically trying to address that opportunity?
That was a very good question. All right, so our belief is very much that the blockchain enables user control. And one of the most important things that we're trying to accomplish is that, which is basically informed by our belief in the future, our identity ourselves in the digital world is represented by a private key. So basically, the future of identity is cryptography utilizing distributed systems like the blockchain. And so what we believe is that using a piece of distributed hardware, not an iPhone, not any other general computing device that you really will not ever have true control of your private key. We use distributed hardware. We've built a consumer product. That's another piece of hardware that I can't mention right now, but you'll use that to represent yourself into digital systems. So for example, we've just partnered with a very large nation state. Later this year, we're rolling out a tokenized version of your passport and your driver's license to be used to identify yourself at a bar, at an airport, at a train station, anywhere else where you have to represent your physical personhood to a digital system. That is the solution that we've built with this government. It's incredibly powerful because you have control. There's someone that it's attesting to the fact that I am Melanie Shapiro, I am X years old, and I have certain authorizations, but ultimately I control the key that is my digital self, and that's incredibly important. And the other part of that I'll end with is all of the things that make up who I am, they don't need to be aware of each other either. So there's this technology that's kind of part of the Bitcoin blockchain it's called hierarchical deterministic wallets, which originally our first product utilized. But basically, you have a seed, which is yourself, your person, and you can generate identities or versions of yourselves from that seed. But they, within some network, don't need to know about each other. And that's really important because I don't need Facebook to know that I have 3 Facebook accounts and 3 Google accounts and whatever else.
Great. So Daniel, I know at Microsoft you spend a lot of time thinking about identity because Microsoft has a lot of products that millions upon millions of people use today to manage identities. So how do you think of the challenge of identity in the world that we all live in, and what are you doing at Microsoft in your organization to reconceptualize that using some of these concepts that come from blockchain technology and distributed systems?
Yeah, so my personal and product philosophy when it comes to the blockchain and identity convergence is that the blockchain is fantastic for a few things and it's really awful at a lot of things. One of the things it's really good at is rooting trust anchors. Things like Turing-style proofs where you stamp the time and state of an occurrence, for instance, on a chain. That yields some value. Another thing in the identity sphere you can do with an anchor is anchor an identifier to a chain. Just think of it as like a new reimagination of DNS, but decentralized, where I can get a list of all the identifiers in the world and find locations off-chain where their data may reside. And that's identity data. It doesn't mean that you have access to all their identity data. It means that for the first time, really, in the world, we have a system by which we can root anchored identifiers and use that as the lookup, essentially, for people's identity data. So we're engaged in building out with a collaborative set of individuals and partners, an open source, cross-chain, system agnostic, decentralized identity layer based on blockchain that runs across all the common chains you would think of. And we want to do that for a few reasons. One big one, mandate from pretty high up, is that we'd like to be in a future where you have a bring your own identity sort of paradigm, where AD and some of the products we have, we're not scared of this new paradigm because they still require you to manage roles and responsibilities and all that good stuff. So if you can just imagine where we're at today is sort of where you were at when you had cell phones when they first came out. You had like a cell phone for work and you had a cell phone for your personal life. And now it just seems crazy, right? You just get a policy on your phone and that's great. I'd like to see a future, and we're building towards a future where you have your identity, it's sovereign to you, and when you get hired, say at Microsoft, they might sign you some attestations, externally attested proofs, that you're an employee, that you can access certain buildings, all this good stuff. And AD would manage that just as it does federated identity and centralized identities today. It would just be educated about this new class of identity. So that's one way we're trying to use it.
So, we could speak for hours on this topic, but I'll leave you guys with two parts which I think are very interesting. The one is when you're using protocols like OAuth. So OAuth is Facebook Connect. So when you go to a website and you click on Facebook Connect, they go and check with Facebook to make sure that you're logged into to Facebook. Facebook tracks that data, then you're able to log into the site, and you're able to reuse those credentials when you go back. So when you're switching between apps, you never have to create an account with that site because you're using your Facebook attested credentials to log in. The problem with that model is one of privacy. So obviously Facebook now knows all the different sites that you're on, and to some extent they can start building patterns around you. And Facebook's just one example of OAuth being used. Where the blockchain comes in is if you could replace a live instance, so for example, Facebook, with something which is static, which is a blockchain ledger, the blockchain doesn't track when you use it. So if the site was able to just look up the keys that you're presenting when you want to log in, confirm that you are the owner of those keys, they can let you log in. There's no trail, there's no history that the site read the blockchain for that information, and therefore you go from a three-party system where 3 parties are effectively involved to 2 parties plus a static ledger, which really, in theory, by the way, that ledger could be offline. It could be printed on a piece of paper, and they could verify keys that way. So it's very, very private and secure. And so that's one way I think blockchains are disrupting the notion of trusted third parties in the world and really making it more peer-to-peer. The second instance was one of censorship. So when you look at, some governments obviously in the world are very oppressive. And some privacy laws are there for a reason, right? So some governments have laws which don't allow you to transmit data outside the country around private personal information. And that actually, to some extent, also applies to what we do in our process, which is, we have one-way hashes. In other words, we take your personal information, we create a hash out of it, which can't be decrypted, so you can never reverse engineer that. It's exceptionally difficult to do. It's probably not possible right now until quantum computing comes in, but in the current paradigm, that one-way hash still represents effectively a token form of your identity. Now, if that information cannot leave the country, you can't make a universal ID system. You can't, how else would you do it? But if you're using a blockchain, essentially the data sits on a blockchain in that country, and because of the way blockchains work, the nodes propagate the data across the world. So this is why Bitcoin is particularly interesting for us, because there are 4,000 or 5,000 nodes worldwide that would have an exact copy of that record, and they're not really breaking the laws and doing that. This is how the system works. So you can actually, effectively build a distributed identity system without breaking any laws and without taking data out of the country. And that's basically what we've leveraged to build our tech.
All right, so let me try to add something new.
We're gonna switch it up.
Yeah, no, but it's fantastic, right? So if Melanie, like the physical association between the human and the identity, between what you guys have now talked about in terms of the system that would make that work to be able to really change the power of flipping the dynamic, right? From Melton, where you started, of identity right now is fragmented and is owned by the authorities with whom we interact, and they're owning it for presumably the purposes of the services we're getting from them. But as we all know, there's a whole degree of discomfort with other ways it's being used. I think one of the things that in our client conversations that's really starting to heat up is the I think everyone kind of gave up on privacy, right? Privacy's gone, right? And if you haven't heard any of those speeches, there's a bunch of people out there who talk very eloquently about, privacy's gone. Like if you're going to debate whether we have privacy or not anymore, you're like 5 years too late. That was, that was a while ago. I see real hope now, actually, to reintroduce the notion of actually, through the combination of these technologies and others, that we'll actually be able to reintroduce a notion of privacy. And then what does that mean for business in particular, in terms of our use of AI and big data and the insights and analytics we're trying to derive from the notion of the authorities owning the identity and the data associated with it. On the positive side, if you could now, as you guys are describing, right, have a single identity traverse that entire ecosystem of businesses and services that you get and work with, that's great, right? You can get much better, much better service, let's say, from like an AI implementation that's not constrained to the company that's implementing it, but could now suddenly draw from data upon your entire life, from a human perspective. That's great side of it. The other side of it, the downside of our business is if the privacy pendulum swings the other way because of what we can do now with with blockchain technology and the associated pieces, then suddenly they may be locked out of things that individuals don't want them to see. And so where's that that balance? And I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation over the next few years in particular.
Absolutely. And I think what all of these dialogues have highlighted is the need for trust. Right, and the issue of privacy is really an issue of trust. So I think for me, what I think about, I was saying to David earlier when we were in the green room, I didn't really think about the way that I divulged components of my identity before I started working first in Bitcoin, which has now really become blockchain. But I used to just put my credit card number, my birth date, my address, my cell phone number into apps. Right? And not even think twice about it. I was like, hey, this is what I want. This is the barrier for me to get it. Here you go, have it, go at it. And that's really scary because what I'm relying on is trusting that application, that third party, to store my data, to manage it, to append and change it, but also to secure it. We also rely on governments, as you've highlighted, to issue us an identity. So if I live in a state where there isn't a strong government, where there aren't strong institutions, what does that mean for my ability to have a recognized identity, which then impacts my ability to open accounts, to have access to financial services, to have access to human rights services. Our employers have a lot of power over our identity. Our banks control parts of our identity. They determine what we can and can't do with our money when we try to make transactions. Telephone companies, hardware companies like Apple, software companies like Microsoft, and all of the different services we rely on in our modern life. So I think this takes the conversation to organizations. And organizations who issue the identity are often responsible for managing it. And what we've seen with the centralization of data is we've created basically the biggest honeypots ever for hackers to go after. If you tell a hacker, if you hack this database, you get the identity of 10 million customers and all of their financial information, that's an extremely, extremely attractive target. I want to just quickly highlight a few really big identity breaches that have happened over the last year, and then we can dig into why they've happened and sort of how we can work with organizations to try to prevent these. The Department of Justice, right, one of the most revered institutions in our country, was hacked, and the identity information of Homeland Security employees and FBI employees was taken. That included their names, their email addresses, and their phone numbers. So think about that for a moment. Very scary. The IRS was hacked. Over 700,000 taxpayer records were stolen. So imagine that you file your taxes every year with the IRS, and someone now has all of that data about you, which includes, by the way, your social security number. It's terrifying. On the healthcare side, a cancer care company in Florida was hacked, and over 2 million patient records were stolen. That included information about their medical history. It included information about their insurance. It included information about their payment history. And you think about the things that are most private too, like these all make me cringe, but we never really think about it in this context. And then lastly, I think the biggest winner of all is Yahoo, right? Over 1 billion customer records were hacked. Just that number, 1 billion, is staggering. That is 15% of the world's population who had their data stolen due to trusting a company that then failed to appropriately manage their personal data. So as I think about that, that gives me this very scary, feeling, this dystopian future where I have no control over my identity. So let's just do a quick audience poll. Who here has had their identity breached or stolen in some way? If you're a Yahoo customer at any point in your life, highly possible. Okay, so that's a lot of people. Like 3 people on this stage here who work in identity and security have had their data stolen. So Dan, since you work at Microsoft, you're thinking all the time about how Microsoft is a custodian of people's identity data. As you think about the way that you are responsible for securing data, what are some things you're speaking to your product teams about in making data around identity more secure, more trusted? What are the things that you're doing today, and what are the things you may do in the future?
Yeah, so the model that we're using to architect these open source underpinnings of this system is essentially trust no one. It is okay that providers, like in our instance, we call these things hubs that may live on a ton of different providers. Microsoft, Google, I want our competitors to run them. There's not competitiveness there. These stores of data, though, are uniquely different in the sense that everything that's written to them is encrypted at the edge. We have absolutely zero knowledge of the data itself. We can only see what we're given. We're an agent like everyone else. If you imagine Cortana in the future might ask for some permissions to your identity, it becomes an agent that only can see and base its AI work, like you were saying, off what you allow it. So we may end up being custodians of your data and able to serve it, but we actually can't see it. And that's one big piece of this system that I think that alone would force the threat vector down to the device level, which is still breachable. Anytime you hit the view layer, right, you have something breachable, but it's just much more difficult, especially with things like what Mel is doing here with the with the token. That adds another layer of security where it's not just that device, but it may be a secondary factor that they would have to breach, which makes it all the more difficult. So those are all things we're taking into account in our product vision, things we're building in the system.
So David, you're advising many of the world's largest financial institutions, right? And this must be on the top of their minds. No one wants to be Yahoo. I think that is clear. So how do you frame, when you go and speak to a client who may have never heard of blockchain technology, right? Maybe they've read about it, they're like, it's this crazy weird thing people on the internet are doing. How do you explain it to them in the context of security, and particularly securing all of the data and the records that they're responsible for custodying? How do you sort of introduce them to that concept, and how do you have that dialogue and set that context?
Yes, I mean, so Dan really kind of started it, right? It's wrapping and your examples kind of highlight it, right? It's wrapping the notion around in a traditional database system, by and large, and there'll be a few people in the room who'll throw something at me afterwards, but by and large, there's a layer of security that wraps around a traditional database, and when you breach that layer of security, the question is how much data that they get, not it's how much, right? Because they have access to either entire tables or entire databases, and the notion of just the fundamental component of blockchain technology is that is a much more granular level data access where individual data elements are encrypted by who put it there, who's allowed to read it, who's allowed to change the state of it, et cetera. And so that granular level data control is a huge leap forward from just this notion of a layer of security that wraps around a data store. It's now embedded within the data store. So that's a great leap forward. And I think that's the simplest place to go. There's a stupid analogy around the Excel table of you're encrypting it at the cell level, not the Excel file level. But I'll spare you that one.
So I'm going to go back to you again. So I think one of the key challenges with all of this is financial services in particular, but a lot of industries that deal with sensitive data are highly regulated. And I think regulators obviously do their best to stay on top of all of these new innovations and really understand how paradigm changes are introducing a need for regulatory changes. But do you think the current regulatory structure that we have may limit the ability for large institutions to implement blockchain? Do you see there being more public-private partnership where those conversations are accelerating? How do you see that interaction working? Because the two seem a little bit at odds at times.
Yeah, so I don't see them at odds, actually.
Okay.
So when you look at the level of investment and focus that the largest financial institutions are applying to blockchain, they have blockchain labs and teams that are as advanced as anybody. You've got the likes of a JP Morgan that creates its own code base, Quorum, and puts it out in open source. So the large financial institutions get it. They're focused on it. They're putting many millions of dollars against it. Is kind of one facet of what you raised. I think the other is there is a realization that you need to that for implementing blockchain-based systems in the traditional financial services space, the path of least resistance and where the fastest progress is getting made is where it works within the current business flows by and large. And fits with the current standards. So there's a big focus right now, and we actually just put out a piece around HSM infrastructure, right? So hardened security modules, hardware security modules, as the standard by which current banks, from ATMs to the major systems that are running securities clearing, a bank's standard practice is to embed the keys and the key management aspects into a physical vault. Tamper-proof vault. If you even nudge it slightly in the wrong way, it destroys itself. It's notion of putting keys into a physical vault is the de facto standard that any CISO at a financial institution will tell you has to exist. So now I'm working with a bunch of startups who have realized, or they've realized all along, where they've reached the stage now where they need to integrate, and doing that HSM integration into a traditional bank's security infrastructure in the traditional standard way is really important, and it's really hard, actually. So there's a big focus on fitting the key management constructs into today's standard as the first step. I think it'll evolve from there, but that's a minimum starting
Absolutely.
point.
So let's go then to the innovators, right? So Melanie and Vinny, you're dealing with this every day, and both of you are in a sense trying to give people ways to manage their own identities, whether it's their physical identity or, Vinny, in your case, a lot of the data associated with their digital identities as well. So as you think about your interaction with traditional institutions, about enabling people to permission out their identity, enabling people to add components to their identity, enabling people to use their identity in new ways. How do you deal with the challenge of educating your users about the importance of managing their own identity? Because it really is a paradigm shift, right? I think people aren't used to thinking in this way about their identity and all of the various aspects of their identity as assets they should guard closely and should manage like they manage other parts of the assets they own. So how do you sort of educate your users on that, and how do you get them to sort of understand the importance of what you're doing?
Well, honestly, I think the NSA is doing that job for all of us. I think they're educating, everybody. And I think that generally the media has shifted the conversation, and there's a lot of work taken off of us. I think a lot of people realize that they need to be in control of their data. So the way that we're pre-launch, so at this point we're just working with partners for integrations that through them we will reach our consumers. So the way that we approach those relationships is very much that you as an organization don't actually want to control your users' data. There's an incredible risk to institutions when they hold all of this information, because if anything happens, whether it's their fault or not, their brand can be tarnished. It's going to look poorly upon their own security measures. And so the way that we look at it is basically in a pyramid, right? So where there are identity attributes, there needs to be self-control. And without self-control, there's no accountability. And where there is no accountability, there is no trust. And so the way that we speak to our partners is that we're ultimately trying to enable our customers to trust that you don't have enough power to control any of their information, and you can trust that the system is protecting your brand or your company from having to be the next Yahoo. And so that's really the way that we're approaching it. And to be honest with you, we've really had very little friction at the partner level at this point. And at the consumer level, I think it's just all about eliminating friction. The problem with a lot of security measures is that every single time you add an additional layer of security, it's an added step or it's added time. And the reality is that consumers very rarely will prioritize security over convenience. That's why there's about 2% of Google accounts that have 2FA on them, which is ridiculous. And these are people that have been hacked before, and then you still don't put two-factor authentication on. The majority of people use one password across 20 websites. And that's just because this model of security is a pain in the ass. And to protect yourselves and use proper security, it's incredibly inconvenient. So to be able to get to that point, we have to make it easy.
Absolutely. So Vinny, you have a similar sort of challenge where you're going out and working with different partners, whether they're financial institutions, government entities, and working with them to sort of participate in this new decentralized identity layer you're creating. So as you go in and have that dialogue, are you finding that people are excited by the idea of having users take more control of their identity, of not taking on that responsibility? Do you find there's still friction or concern? What are the dialogues you're having with your partners as you try to introduce this new paradigm?
So when we think about our business, we think of it as a consumer data privacy company. We actually don't look at ourselves as an identity company. We think that identity is a subset of your data, right? So how do we secure data, make it private? When we look at partners, there's really no incentive for them often to change. And this is the problem with bigger companies, that's just the way it is, right? And when you look at Google, for example, and two-factor authentication, well, we're at 2% right now with all the hacks and everything else. And I know some serious business guys who don't have a second factor on their email boxes, and these guys are running multi-million or billion-dollar companies. So it's very scary where the world is. But there is a reason for this. So the notion of two-factor, does everyone know what two-factor authentication is? Okay, good. Just checking.
I think we saw a few no's. Do you want to just quickly?
So two-factor authentication is, for those who don't know, for example, you have the Google Authenticator app where you type the code in after you log into your email, or you may have an RSA key where the code keeps changing, and so you need that extra step. So it's a username, a password, and then an extra code to get into whatever you're using. Your bank they may send you a text message to log in with a code. That's the second factor. So the user experience is actually one which is in question here. Why do we need to have that second factor? Why do we need to have a username and password? And in fact, especially because your username and password is being used on all these other sites, it gets hacked one place, it's going to be used in other places, and they have bots automating access to multiple accounts. So, for example, if your username at Yahoo is whatever, vlingham@yahoo.com, and they will
Is
go.
that your username?
Actually, I do have an old email, but it doesn't matter.
told me that.
I have two-factor authentication on. So if you have that, they'll go use that username and go check out vlingham@gmail.com to see the password works there as well, and that's how they get into your accounts. So it's not very secure anyway. So the current metaphors we have around user access needs to be challenged. So from a user experience perspective, wouldn't it be easier if you just had your identity on your phone, you could scan a code and log into an app? Or your banking or website or your email, no additional codes. People don't understand this stuff. So when you talk to average consumers, they don't understand. I mean, using a password was a big step for a lot of people 20 years ago. I mean, a huge step. I think my dad hasn't gotten there yet. So, it's one way. If you change the paradigm of how systems are accessed and away from having to have the second factor and it's just kind of built into the experience, I think we'll have more success there. So that's, for me, it's a lot of it's a user experience approach. And then when it comes to the companies, well, adopting these additional technologies and adopting easier, frictionless methods, if that can help secure systems, or it can help make it easier, if their customer support levels are going to go down, the risks go down, then they'll adopt it. But only typically at the point in time where they've had a breach or they've had some issues. So those are the challenges there. I do want to make one point on what David said earlier on. Sorry to get cut back here. As much as banks and financial institutions are investing a ton of money in blockchain, I don't think they quite understand it. And there's two reasons for this. The first one is a lot of the banks got together and started an organization called R3, where they just pumped, untold amounts of money into it to build this blockchain-based system to compete with Bitcoin and whatnot. And one of my most popular tweets of all time was this. I said, Satoshi Nakamoto, the guy who invented Bitcoin, he created it in 2008 and released it in early 2009. And so the tweet was, I can't remember the exact words, but Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin because banks didn't trust each other. And the banks created R3 to prove it. Because R3 has really collapsed. I mean, they're not even using blockchain technologies anymore. And then the second reason is this. The best cryptographers I know and the best cryptographers in the world will never work for a bank or any major institution. These guys are like tinfoil hat guys that sit in like garages in Palo Alto.
David looks
and
very sad
stuff.
now. I think
David is
I'm one of these.
Yeah.
but David looks fine.
He's
on
a
the good
different.
side.
But I'm undercover at Microsoft.
Yeah, he's undercover. He's a mole.
You're not supposed to say that publicly.
But majority of these guys don't work in these big banks, and Microsoft isn't a bank, so that's fair. But because think about it, like the Bitcoin system was built in sort of in attack of the banking system to an extent. So then you have these vulnerabilities that come out, and this is the problem with the banking system and blockchain and Bitcoin right now. And I just had to have my piece there. Sorry, David.
All right. I love this. Bitcoin coming back in. Okay.
He has a rebuttal if he wants.
Do you want to take a moment?
Yeah, we won't have a lot of time left. So I'll just say I wouldn't count R3 out just yet. There's some pretty big court implementations underway, but but you're right. They've taken a different technical path.
Yeah.
I also wouldn't count the banks out yet, because if you look at the hiring profiles, we're actually seeing a whole bunch of those special people getting hired into them.
Money
So,
talks.
Exactly. It's a huge focus, and the banks have certainly woken up to the fact that that if they don't invest heavily in this space, then they'll be in trouble. So when you combine money and focus, things happen. I wouldn't.
Not always good things.
But I would just add, as someone who's on the investing side and also working with institutions, I think the entrepreneurs do it in a scale of months and years, whereas institutions, it's a matter of decades. It's just, it takes a lot of time to shift the focus of an institution that's 100,000 people large. But maybe we'll be surprised.
At that too. More and more banks are rolling out
All right, that's the bet.
6-8 week cycles.
We said it here, that's the bet. We'll see you in a year. All right, so we've had a lot of discussion around digital identity, around security. I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience around what was discussed, things that weren't addressed. And if you have someone specific you'd like to address it, let us know.
Yes, my name is Johannes from Deutsche Telekom in Germany. Thanks for the great discussion. Let me add one special thing that is on my mind for a while. Let me do an experiment. When I come back to the US the next time and standing at the immigration, I will ask the officer whether I could use my Facebook credentials to enter the country. So saying that, to me, identity is more fundamental than about entering a website or protecting my data. And to me, at the very end, the state is in charge to guarantee my identity, independent which technology might be underlying. But it's a fundamental issue that has to be done by the state to make it international. And if the US maybe let me in with my Facebook credentials, I'll be in trouble in China the next day. So maybe this might be an identity or a guarantee that me, myself, and I are the very person standing in front of someone that all your business model may be based on in the future.
So I
Thanks.
think Melanie has some comments.
I can tell you that. Let me start here. I can tell you that that's changing. There are groups of organizations and governments that are working together to make it a reality that you can move freely as an individual throughout the world on one system. Starting there. The second is, if you are at all interested in identity, I highly recommend The Sovereign Individual. It's an amazing book, and it very much talks through all of this. And you're right, very much right now the state controls your identity. In the future, we will have self-sovereignty. It's very hard to imagine that right now, but the types of things that we're working on put in the rails to make those kinds of futures imaginable. It makes it possible. Because ultimately, the state should not have control over whether you are a person with an identity or not. Imagine people moving around from the Middle East, for example, and coming into another country. They're not coming to the US or Germany with any sort of passport or identity. Nobody is trusting those credentials. And that's very problematic, as we see with our president, who isn't letting them here. And the reason is, beyond craziness, that we don't know who they are. We don't know if they're involved in any sort of illicit activity. But in the future, we will be able to have pieces of information attested to you as a person where you can walk into another country and they have only what they need to know about you. And I think the last piece of that I'll say is, I guess the best example I have is my father-in-law immigrated as a refugee from Soviet Russia. And when they left with nothing, as most refugees do. He has a PhD from Russia, came to this country, he basically has no education. That should be able to transfer. And if he had control of that artifact, if you will, then he would be able to live here with the same degree that he had when he was there.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add.
What? I mean, it is happening. We are live with a nation state in 2017. Is it going to be for everybody in this room? Absolutely not. Is it going to be for every country? No. But it's happening, and that innovation happens. That's how it happens, step by step by step. And big companies, Microsoft is one of them, they're doing an amazing job to leverage the things that they already have, the rails they already have, to make a lot of this possible.
One of those that's going to try and make that real, and this is still very formative phases, but we're sufficiently motivated to reimagine some parts of LinkedIn. I mean, if you really look at your LinkedIn profile, it's essentially self-attested data. You can't prove that you worked anywhere. You can't prove, Melanie's father-in-law's degree. We want to make that a reality. So if you can imagine all these organizations and educational institutions having their own self-sovereign identity that stands for those institutions, and being able to sign a proof and give it to you in a self-sovereign data store that you can bear at any place in the world, not geographically landlocked, where that data about your identity answers to no one but you, that's where we want to be, and we're going to try and make that happen.
Yes.
On the time, and just another data point on the timeline. It's kind of you're going to see all of the puzzle pieces that are required to do that be announced and come together in weeks and months, not longer. The scale and implementation and the rollout is a different thing, but the puzzle pieces are all going to be there in a very short time frame.
And I think that's the exciting part is it's not just incumbents and startups, but there are also regulators, institutions, academic institutions involved. So I think there's a lot of exciting work coming. We have one final question that we have time for. So I don't know if we have
She
a
looks very
microphone.
motivated to ask a question.
There we go. Go ahead. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Natasha. From a security perspective on protecting our blockchain identity, what are your thoughts on implementing iris recognition software and fingerprint recognition along with the token keys for additional forms of authentication? What are your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. So biometric data for identity security. You look so eager, David.
Yeah, no, it's a huge focus of ours. We have the leading biometrics platform globally. Like I said earlier, we've implemented most of the world's border control systems. Where you're using biometrics today, we've been helping to build all of that, and we see that future in it, right? So if you can use if your biometrics can be an attestation that are part of this, and then an interaction point where your body is your body or a device associated with your body, and the combination of those things, that's an enormously powerful thing, and it's really starting to gain momentum in a small but I think spectacular way. If you go look at MasterCard just rolled out the biometrics on card, right? First implementations, but that's going to go quick. It's to the convenience point, right? It's easy. It's insert, thumb, done. That's a beginning. Our phones, right? We've all gotten very used to thumbprint, open phone. I think that the whole notion of your body being that key and access point is going to ramp very, very quickly, and it's a huge focus of ours.
Can I just
Absolutely,
so
Benny.
one of the things which I'll disagree slightly on this, purely because of I think it stymies the growth of this sector worldwide because of regulations, right? So the moment you're storing biometric data on certain citizens, it can't be taken out of the country. You have to have servers locally. So the rollout for these types of technologies is a lot more difficult to do when biometrics are actually captured and stored. And so if we're going to take that approach, it's going to take a lot longer than any of us would like to see global identities being issued. And so that's the trade-off, right? You can decentralize it, and you can do it at a device layer where, for example, Apple, it's stored on your device. Apple doesn't store a copy on the servers, and therefore the devices can float around worldwide, and they're not breaking any laws. But the moment you centralize the data on a server, and you try to take it out of a country, you're going to be, and so those regulations have to change in order for that to be
That's
considered.
not what's going on, though. Those puzzle pieces together actually will undo that, because that is the problem.
Sure. But the problem is when it comes to regulations, we all know it's the order of 10 years.
We've
5
actually,
years.
for the past 3 years, have been developing libraries, biometric libraries. We've hired a team of scientists to be doing this for us. We used biometrics on our very first product, and we felt it our responsibility that if we were going to use biometrics, then we needed to make sure that the way they were secured was better than what's currently available to us. Because right now, honestly, it's garbage. You either put your biometrics on a secure element, or you have to move them to the cloud. That's really it. And so we've developed something really interesting that actually enables there to be biometrics captured and taken without ever being stored. It's different than the way Apple's doing it. There's no need for secure elements storing minutia points. Minutia points are never stored. And that helps you move away from these regulations where you can use biometrics to move globally across the world. That's really, really important, because you don't want anybody having the only 10 passwords you have, because you can't change these.
And on that fantastic note, are you all terrified about your identity data now?
Read The Sovereign Individual. It's the best book ever.
All right, so we're all going to go home, enable 2FA on all our accounts. Everyone should sign up for Civic,
free
read
ID
Self-Sovereign
protection.
Identity, watch for Microsoft's upcoming exciting identity announcement, and check out the great work Accenture is doing. Thank you, everyone. I hope this was informative.